Hello and welcome. This is Working Class to World Class. But before we go any further, I do have a little favour of you. If you could hit that follow or subscribe button, then that would be a massive help. Thank you. In this episode, I chat with a man that many consider to be the king of advertising, having worked in some of the biggest campaigns for some of the biggest brands in the world. His story is very humbling, one that comes from that working class start in life. And check him out now, he is one of the most respected people in the business. Breaking through the barriers of adversity, I'm Lynn Lester, and this is Working Class to World Class. So, a very warm welcome, Sir John Hegarty. I don't know how you feel about being called Sir.
Well, what the polite thing apparently to do is you introduce me as Sir John Hegarty, and then, for me anyway, after that it's John. So that's I think the protocol that is best.
Yeah, I think so too. You know, to us, you're John today. And so for John, for everyone tuning in, there's a lot of people that are not in the advertising world that will be listening to this. So I would really love to set the scene on literally how successful you are. So could you give people, a very brief biog of who is John Hegarty?
Oh, oh God, I like to keep it as short as I possibly can. I've worked in advertising for about 50 years. Terrifying thought, really, when you think about it. I helped found Saatchi & Saatchi in 1970, working with Charles Saatchi. I then went on to help start the London office of TBWA, a very well-established European agency. And then in 1982, with my two other partners, John Bartle and Nigel Bogle, I set up BBH, Bartle Bogle Hegarty, in London. They now have, because I'm no longer there, have something like 9 offices around the world. And so I suppose some of our most famous work would have been Levi's, Laundrette, Nick Kamen taking his clothes off in the laundrette. We had Vorsprung durch Technik for Audi. We did Keep Walking for Johnny Walker, worked with British Airways, Unilever, huge brands, Boddington's, all kind of fabulous brands. So quite a relatively successful career in advertising. In 2014, I set up the Garage in Soho here, which is what we call an early stage investment company where we help businesses, business ideas get off the ground, find them finance, and then guide them, hopefully through building their brand, because that's where value resides. And then 2 years ago, we set up Garage Entertainment, which is teaching businesses about creativity, about the importance and value of creativity, and how, if you want to progress as a business, especially with the development of AI, then understanding your creative skills and how to employ them is going to be crucial to your success. So that's a rough run through it.
Wow. I mean, I think, you can't underestimate how successful that career has been. I mean, 50 years is, you're right, that's quite terrifying for me when I even think about, I've been like in media for over 25 years, something. And so for me, that's scary. I can only imagine how it feels for you.
Well, I came into advertising in 1965, and the only way I kind of do it by saying it was around about the time the Beatles were releasing Help. So it kind of gives it a sort of a kind of a value, a sort of, oh yeah, that was pretty good. But I sometimes when I talk to students, and they used to sort of, they'd say to me, oh, when did you get into advertising? And you realize it was, for them a long time ago. So I used to say around about the time that Gutenberg invented movable type, just as a kind of joke. And then of course, turn of the kind of into the noughties, I suddenly realized that joke wasn't working anymore, because they'd look at me and I'd say, Gutenberg and movable, and they sort of go, who the hell's Gutenberg and what's movable type? I mean, what's going on here? So I then had to have a new one, which was around about the time I came into advertising, around about the time that we paid for music and water was free. So that was my other way of doing it.
That is a good one. And what's really funny is, I've known of you for all my career basically. And, laterally when we've caught up, I had no idea of one thing. And that was, of course, your working class roots, which we talked which we're going to talk a lot about in a second. But so for me, it was just mesmerizing, because the whole point of this podcast is to offer value, give inspiration, and just tell people your story, because I think people see you as, to your point, the guy that's worked in Levi, the most successful campaigns in the world. So for this session, what I'd love to do is strip you of the sir, because at the moment we're going to take you to John, the wee guy. And I would love to know where you were brought up and born first.
Well, I was born in North London. Both my parents were Irish. My father was from Cork, and my mother was from Cork City. But they for all kinds of reasons, which they met in London, and that's where I was born. So it was a very working class family. I kind of went to, obviously, schooling, but I was able to go to art school. And I was really, really keen on drawing and on art and things like that. So I was able to go to art school, which kind of gave me an enormous fillip, in the sense of, when you went to art school, nobody cared where you came from. They only cared where you were going. There was no class sense to it. And in fact, I would argue probably it was actually quite good to be working class. I mean, I think, it's a very interesting point, this, and it's something we've talked a lot about, which is, I think, the whole revolution in the 50s and 60s that we were all kind of benefiting from was the very first time that it was from the ground up. It started as a sort of working class movement. If you look at the musicians, you look at the playwrights, you look at what was going on in cinema, painting, it was not a top-down revolution, it was a bottom-up revolution. And I think that's one of the most significant things about the 50s and 60s. And I think this is what people should realize and appreciate, is they're not trying to be someone else. What this revolution allowed you to be was you. Who you were, what you believed in, where you came from. And I think the other thing for me that was interesting was that, I came from a sort of Irish household, and then I would go out and I'd meet my friends, and they'd be all English, and it taught you to observe, because you suddenly thought, oh, we talk in a slightly different way. We use words like that. We use language like that. My English friends, so to speak, would talk in a slightly different way. And you realized very early on that observing what people do and how they do it was something that fed your creativity. And it's quite interesting, actually, if you look at so many great creative people. I'm not saying I'm great by any means, but you look at them, they were outsiders. And I think being an outsider is very interesting, because it teaches you observation. It teaches you to look, to regard, to consider, to think about. So that kind of background for me was very beneficial. And so I went to art school. From art school, I went to design school. Because I sort of loved ideas, I thought, well, painting, I'm not going to be the next Picasso, but I was advised maybe you should try graphic design, which I did. And it was whilst I was at studying graphic design, a wonderful, wonderful teacher, a man called John Hegarty, showed us all the brilliant work coming out of New York at that time, advertising work. And suddenly I looked at this work and I thought, it's not only smart, it's kind of interesting, it's clever, it's funny, but it's also inclusive. And I thought it was all about ideas, and I loved ideas. I loved dealing with it. And so suddenly there I was studying graphic design, and a light was thrown on in a darkened room. And I thought, this is what I want to do. And I then developed a portfolio about advertising. Of course, at that time in design school, it was, it was a bit like you've joined the devil. You've got, oh, you're going to sell things. And you go, well, yeah, well, that's what you do, don't you, when you're packaging and designing packs and record sleeves and all those things you're trying to sell. And but it was a fabulous time to come into the industry. It was growing. It was 1965, so the whole revolution was happening. Of course, in advertising, it happened 10 years later, but it was sort of controlled by corporations who are always about 10 years behind. So, what was happening on the streets was not quite happening in corporate boardrooms. But eventually that revolution caught up, and advertising became part of this change in attitude to the way communication works, and benefited from that. So that's the sort of quick background.
I mean, it is a pretty colourful career, and the path that you had taken to get there, which I do want to get into in a bit more detail in a second. But one of the things I loved that you said, and I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, was the outsider mentality and the observation. Because actually, being working class, you are different to a degree. And so you have to think and shape yourself in maybe perhaps ways that others don't need to think about in the same way, which is, when you sort of say that, you kind of think, well, actually, you can really understand why you're good at what you do because you understand people.
Yeah, it was sort of, in life, you have to get lucky. I mean, there's no question about it. I mean, my father did say to me once, John, there's no point being Irish if you don't get lucky. So get lucky, right? And I did. And timing, of course, is fundamentally important in life. You've got to be there at the right moment with the right tools, with the right opportunities. But I think the thing that I felt, the lesson there is that if you want to be a great creative person, then I think you've got to be true to who you are. I think you've got to reflect who you are, what you are. And if you look at any great artist, any great musician, they're talking from their point of view. They're talking from their experiences, what affected them, what they love, what they like. And they aren't trying to be someone else. They're not trying to be, trying to please a certain group of people, a certain cohort of people. They're just being themselves and making that connection. And when you do that, when you talk from your own truth, it does have a power that connects with people, even if though their truth will be different, but you kind of, I sort of understand that. I understand where that person's coming from. And even when, you're talking about being in a commercial world, which I was, I wasn't writing a book or my songs, or I was being commissioned. Even there, you're still putting yourself into the work. You're still going, actually, this is what I would respond to. And so therefore, it's fundamentally important that you kind of are true to who you are, what you are, and actually reflect that in your work, whatever it is you're doing, if you're commissioned or if you're not commissioned. Fundamentally important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, through this series, I've actually found some people who have been really challenged to be who they were growing up, and they've had to reinvent themselves because maybe they were embarrassed or maybe they just wanted to get out of that. So it's really refreshing to hear you say that. And what I would really love to know a bit more is like the kind of like the early days. So you were saying you were brought up in London. Tell me about your family circle.
Oh, well, it was again, it was very, very broad. I sort of had uh, working class, bought in a council estate in North London, and it 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 was post-war. We were all kind of suffering from what had happened during the war, but actually it was a sort of wonderful time, really, because what it was opportunity was opening out, and it just was there for you to grab. But I think the important thing is, and I did this mad thing. I used to have to go and to make money as a kid, so I started playing golf. I was sort of caddying, I should say. Caddy. I had a very good golf course very near where we live, Finchley Golf Course. And so I used to go caddying, and then rapidly realized that if you could play the game, you could earn a lot more money because you could give people tips, and you could say, well, I wouldn't do that, look at that, even though you were 11 years old or something. And so I lived on a golf course, literally, from as soon as I got out of school, went to the golf course, played golf, caddied, made money. And I kind of had this world of where I was playing this funny game called golf. And and again, you were being introduced to completely different people, different kind of backgrounds and, quite middle class and things like that. And again, you were able to observe that. But what I found interesting about it was that if you were really, really good at something, again, people didn't care. People didn't care, again, that you were working class and they were upper middle class. But, suddenly when they saw you hit a golf ball 250 yards, they sort of stood back in awe. And so I learned very quickly that this idea of having a skill gets you further. So get a skill. And of course, what happens is you get to about 15 on a golf course and you suddenly look around you and think, the women on golf courses aren't really very attractive. And so shocking, isn't it? You're not supposed to say things like that.
See what you like?
It was true. It was true. And though at that time, you could go to art school on Saturday mornings. So at the age of, I was just 15, I went to Hornsey Art School on a Saturday morning. And that was my introduction to creativity and art. And as much as I liked kind of, drawing and things like that, suddenly I was able to go there. And again, this wonderful door was opened. And it was a phenomenal opportunity. And for some reason, they stopped doing that. I mean, it went on for about 20 years, but then they stopped opening art schools on Saturday mornings. Except right now, they are trying to reintroduce it. It's called the Saturday Club, where schools are opening on Saturday mornings for students, anybody to go to and experience a skill of some kind or another. And it's about opening windows, opening doors. And one of my little quotes is, do interesting things and interesting things will happen to you. If you keep opening interesting doors, you don't know what's going to happen, what's going to come through them. And so that for me was really wonderful. And again, it was a sort of, you'd go from, because I'd still have to work on Sundays, caddying to make money. But on Saturday morning, I was going to art school. On Sunday morning, I was back in this very sort of upper middle class environment, observing how it was different. But that was a sort of a wonderful way of being introduced into different forms of society and how society worked. Again, being an observer of that. And seeing how it operated. But it was, the other thing too is it was great. And of course, the other thing about that time was music. Music was a tremendous driver of culture. I mean, still is, but more so back then because, I actually witnessed the development of rock and roll. I was there when kind of people like Elvis Presley suddenly burst upon the scene, and Bill Haley and all those Chuck Berry and people like that. We loved all these people, and then I got very much into jazz and the blues, and used to go and try and hear music and hear the blues and stuff like that because I really liked it. And then, of course, I remember coming into school, and it was the day the music died when Buddy Holly was killed and the Big Bopper died, and of course, the wonderful song, The Day the Music Died. I can remember coming to school that morning and we were all kind of distraught. But then what happened is there was a sort of lull, and then, jazz really took over. My brother, who was 2 years older than me, he went to St. Martin's, and I used to go and see him. And St. Martin's in Charing Cross Road then was probably, I would say, the coolest place in the world. I mean, it was just unbelievable. Everything. So this is like 1960. I was 16. He was 18. And everything that was going to happen in London was happening at that address in Charing Cross Road. I mean, the music, jazz, the way they would be, the way that, fashion department would work with sculptor would work with painting. They were doing pop art. I mean, it was phenomenal just to go there as a sort of an institution and look at what was happening. And that was tremendous. But again, it was kind of driven also by music, wonderful kind of, and their common room, which was, you'd all meet in the was again the meeting place that, it was the place to be. 1960, there was nowhere better than that common room, St. Martin's, Charing Cross Road, just phenomenal. I didn't go to St. Martin because I thought my brother's there. I don't want to go with my brother. So I went to Hornsey, which I loved and had a great time there. But then I went on to to London College of Printing, as it was called, now called the London College of Communication, to do graphic design. But that music driving things. And we were incredibly lucky in the sense of that we knew the before and the after. I mean, before Elvis Presley, what was there? There were crooners and people like that, and Frank Sinatra didn't really connect. Yeah, it was okay. It didn't really connect with a sort of 16, 14, 15, 16-year-old. But suddenly, someone like Elvis Presley coming along, or Chuck Berry, and then of course, I remember there's the most incredible. Everybody should watch it. It's called Jazz on a Summer's Day. And it's a documentary made on the Newport Jazz Festival, 1958. It's a most fantastic documentary. You can get it online. It's there. It was shot by Bert Stern, the great photographer who did the last photographs of Marilyn. And it captures a moment in time. And at the end of it, Chuck Berry comes on and does Sweet Little 16 and does his duck walk across the stage. And you can kind of see people, the other jazz musicians go, I'm not sure what to make of this. But a great moment, because what you had was a juxtaposition with one way of doing it and another way of doing it. And I think a lot of creativity comes out of juxtaposing one thing with another thing. And I always tell this story that when we first went to art school, and you kind of know that somebody's going to say to the teacher, oh, how do you make black really black? How do you mix it with blue, or do you put green in or something? And I always remember the teacher had this withering look at the student. He said, put it next to white. And that in a way is the most phenomenal lesson. Put it next to white. And it juxtapose one thing with another thing. And you get this tension, you get this drama. And so we had that with what was happening with music. There was very, very, really not great music, and the real music. Who did you really listen to? Were you a Beatles fan, a Stones fan? Did Bob Dylan was coming along? Protest music that came when jazz kind of, I can always remember my brother came to me and he said, they just somebody put on Please Please Me in the common room. It was not jazz. And suddenly jazz died. And it was like, it changed. It just changed overnight. Suddenly the Beatles. And that was it. And that was another change. But you don't sort of get that now, for all kinds of reasons, because we've explored all those things. And that's the benefit of being growing up when I grew up and being where I was. So that juxtaposition of one thing against another thing, quite constant in my life.
It's quite cool. It does sound as if you were brought up in a really cool, funky, like never to be lived again era, which it does sound sensational. But were your parents ever into like music, or what did they do?
No, my father was not at all. Hardly had a creative bone in his body. I mean, the only good thing he really said, apart from, if no point being Irish if you can't get lucky. The only other thing he said, the best thing I can give you is an education, because that can't be taken off you. But my mother was she loved music, she would like any, if it was good music, she'd like it, and had a very open mind. And I learned from her to have an open mind, just approach things positively, not negatively. Oh, I don't like that, or whatever it is, and if you have that way of being, I think it again welcomes things in, and I think if you're a creative person, you're absorbing lots of stuff. That's why I say, stop walking around with headphones on, because you're cutting yourself off. You're not listening, hearing, observing. You've retreated into your own little world, and sometimes that's nice. I kind of understand it. But when you see people just constantly walking around, not connected to what's going on around them. And of course, it's the incidental nature of things that you constantly want to be open to. And if you're not that, then you're not going to pick up all lovely little stories. I always tell this lovely story about Paul Smith, the fashion designer. And he's got a whole book on this thing of be aware. Look, inspiration is everywhere. You just have to see it. And he tells the story of being at Milan airport and, as usual, trying to fly home for a Friday night and flights delayed. Typical. It's always happening at Milan. And anyway, so he goes, oh God. And so instead of putting headphones on or slumping into it, I just go for a walk. And so he just goes for a little walk, and he sees on the floor a little Lucky Charm bracelet. A Lucky Charm was broken off a bracelet. And he picks it up and he looks at it and he goes, wow, that's interesting. Actually, that would make a very good button on a shirt. And so he then goes, he launches Lucky Charms as buttons. And he then goes and says, so 30,000 shirts later, I decided that was enough of Lucky Charms. But had he not gone for that walk, had he not looked around and absorbed things, he wouldn't have done that. And it's a lovely story about inspirations everywhere. You've got to look. So cutting yourself off is, I think, one of the most dangerous things that I see people doing today. It's a real worry because you kind of withdraw into the world that you feel comfortable with, and you need to be challenged. You need to see things that you don't normally see or hear, or conversations, or the way people talk, or the problems they might have, or whatever it might be. And you're bringing that. All of that comes into your work. It comes into you and then comes back out again as a thought, as an idea. And that it's crucially important that. And as I say, going back to my upbringing, I was born at a time when that was much easier to do. And we had a kind of juxtaposition between one sort of genre and another, which you don't get so much today.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think the thing is, I remember as a kid sitting playing with little daisies, making daisy chains and, literally looking at the sky. And now it is, everything's heads down. You go in any transport, nobody's really chatting. I mean, I'm a bit of a chatterbox anyway, so I'll just talk to strangers and they're like, oh, this is odd. Especially when you go to London, people think it's weird. And, you can have...
Person doing it.
Yeah, exactly. I guess, like from the way you're sort of talking, it does sound like the heyday, it was brilliant. But I guess for me, I firmly believe that success also comes from great adversity at times. And you were talking, you sort of touched on your working class roots in terms of you're from the council estate. Like, were there hard times as well?
Yes, there were. But I think what happens is if you're born into, I was thinking the other day about this little council flat we lived in. I mean, it was minute. How did we all get round the table to have a meal? I mean, there were 5 of us because my great aunt, my mother's sister, had come over from Ireland to live with us. And how did we? Well, I can't. But it worked. But that was it. You didn't sort of go into other people's homes, and you went into the homes of people that were around you. But at that point in life, I didn't have people who were much wealthier than me as friends. So you didn't see so where you were was the way it was, and conversation was interesting, and always debates about things, and that lovely everybody's talking but nobody's listening. It was like it was walking and there was a constant radio on, but it was just conversation, and it was lovely, that kind of sense of community and how people responded to each other, and you spoke to your neighbor, and so it was a kind of lovely a lovely atmosphere. I didn't feel that I'm sort of living in some deprived kind of life, or that where I am is terrible. It was what it was, and that was it. That's So I think you look back, as I said, and I think, God, how do we all fit into the flat? And I do remember that there's that lovely Monty Python sketch, isn't it, when they're talking about I lived in a shoebox. You lived in you had a shoebox, that great sketch thing. And I often say this to my kids. I say, God, we didn't have any central heating. I can remember ice on the inside of the window getting up, and they, oh, here we go, But that's just the way it was. We didn't didn't have anything to compare it with, so you didn't sort of worry about it really. So I can't do that. I do think adversity is a great driver of creativity, but I don't think it's. I think it's also more fundamentally about your imagination. Feeding your imagination. Of course, you can talk about adversity and how in certain cultures, the old joke about, Switzerland and the cuckoo clock, and actually it was Germans who invented the cuckoo clock, by the way, not the Swiss. But you can, if everything's too comfortable, then why have a great idea? I mean, I do always say, for great creativity, you need bad weather, because, you can't go out and just lay around and stuff like that. You've got to, the weather's bad, so you've got to go in and have an idea, haven't you? You've got to imagine it being better. So there is a lot of evidence to show that bad weather creates more creativity. I think there's some fact about the amount of Nobel Prize winners who come from the Northern Hemisphere, or the northern part of the Northern Hemisphere, is far greater than anywhere else. And I think that's because the weather's so shit. You have to go do something, you can't chill out in a park or on a, whatever it might be, or sitting outside a cafe having a great time. No, you've got to go and have an idea. So, but I think it's more about how you engage with your imagination. And that's the most difficult place to be, imagination. I always say to people, Shakespeare never went to Italy, but he wrote Romeo and Juliet, and he wrote Two Gentlemen of Verona. And he went there in his imagination. It's the most amazing place to travel, because you can go anywhere you like, when you like, how you like, in whatever way you like. And then you can write about it, think about it, talk about it, sing about it, whatever. So it in a sense, it's engaging with your imagination that's so important.
I think that's fantastic. I mean, that's a really good tip, isn't it? Even all the little nuggets that you're giving away, everything from, the observation to the imagination to the opportunity to the learning a skill. I mean, these are so many fundamentals. Actually, when you sit back and you look, they are the making often of someone. So I think, thank you for that sort of, I guess, wise words. One of the things I was really intrigued by was when we were chatting, and I didn't realise, we get talking about working class, and I didn't realise you were working class because you sound very polished, and you don't sound so. And again, that's a stereotype in my head. You don't sound to me working class. So did your accent change as the years went on, or is this always how you've sounded?
Well, no, well, funny enough, actually, I didn't go into the detail of it. My mother actually was. She's Irish, but she was born in Cork. But her father, my grandfather, was in the army, and so she literally, after a year, they moved to India, and my mother was brought up partly in India, and so she didn't talk with an Irish accent. She talked with a very kind of middle of the road accent. Middle of the road sounds terrible to say it like that, but she wasn't posh, but she had a very nice accent. And again, the family have always been about education, on my father's side and her side. So she went to a good school and that, even though we were working class. My father was categorized as a labourer, so he was, he was basically a park keeper. So my mother was not. She wasn't sort of East End or anything like that. So I never actually, I tell you what I don't like being is typecast. I don't want somebody to decide who you are. And I used to remember actually, a friend of my father's used to come and see him, an Irish friend, and he would insist on calling me Sean, which of course, as we all know, is Irish for John. And I used to get really annoyed. I'd say, my name's not Sean, my name's John, and I thought, why am I getting annoyed about this? And I realized that what it is it's defining me. And I don't want somebody else to define me. I want to define myself. And obviously Hegarty is an Irish name. I'm not in any way saying I'm not proud of my Irish background. I am. But I want to decide how it is defined, not somebody else doing. So I think that sense of not fitting into somebody's obvious box is something that I was sort of, not that I overly worked at it. And again, when you went to art school, it was such a mixture of people that, accents just blurred and nobody really thought about it or cared about it. So I didn't sort of consciously change it. It was just sort of the way we lived in our particular household and the way we went out into the world.
Yeah, I mean, it was cool. I mean, the minute I knew, I was like, oh my good, Ricky, you're on the podcast. That's great. So yeah, thank you for being here. And, is there any kind of things growing up that you think, God, if you could do it again, you would love to do certain things? I don't know if it's maybe the golf course or the caddying, but or maybe that common room.
Yeah. Well, I wish I'd learned to play tennis rather than golf. That was the only thing, because actually it's a game that you can take with you. But again, at our school, it was a sort of fairly working class school. That tennis was something they played. You got to play tennis like once every 6 months or something like that, whereas you played football and cricket. But I think actually, if I should have learned to play tennis, and which I love. I adore play. I don't play much now, but I love playing tennis, which is a bit more accessible than golf. Golf takes like 5 hours or something, and by the time you go and come back, whereas a tennis, you can go and play tennis and come back within an hour. But no, not really. I sort of, people often say to you, what would you have changed? And I don't think I would have changed anything. I mean, because you don't know what would have happened if you changed something. Well, that wouldn't have happened. Here's a story that I always tell about this. And when I finally left the London College of Printing, where I was doing graphic design, but I had decided to become an art director. I wanted to be an art director in advertising. I'd created a portfolio, and I came out in lots of job interviews, and I had 2 job offers. One was at an agency called Young and Rubicam, which is still around, and the other was at an American agency, but both American agencies actually, but Y&R still exist, at another agency called Benson and Bowles. Benson and Bowles were in Knightsbridge, and I'd said to a friend of mine, look, I've got this dilemma about which one should I take. Should I take Young and Rubicam? Should I take Benson and Bowles? And by the way, the Young and Rubicam job is paying twice as much as the Benson and Bowles job. And a friend of mine said, and at that time, Benson and Bowles were bringing over a wonderful American art director to lead the art department, who was highly awarded. And my friend said to me, John, I think I would, despite the fact that they're paying you half, I would go to Benson and Bowles because they're bringing this guy over, which you know about, we've talked about, and I think that will be really beneficial. And so I thought, yeah, I'm going to do that. So I did it. And within 2 weeks of me joining Benson and Bowles, the creative director walks into my office and says, I found a young copywriter for you to work with. And I thought, who's that? And he said, Charles Sarchi. And I went, oh, God, he's Italian. He lives at home with mum and he can't spell. Just my luck for a copywriter. And, well, I was wrong on 2 fronts. He did live at home with mum, and he wasn't very good at spelling. But actually, and of course, he wasn't Italian. He was Jewish. But he was also a brilliant, brilliant writer and had a wonderful influence on my career because we had a great partnership and did things together. So had I not taken, it's that sliding doors thing. So you say to yourself, well, had I gone for the money, not the opportunity, what would have changed? And of course, you can't define it. But there is a lesson in there, is that go for it. Certainly in a creative profession, whatever you're doing, go for the opportunity, not the money. The money will come. The money will come eventually. Nothing wrong with money. It's good, but money has a voice. It doesn't have a soul. And I think you have to kind of think about your own career, how you're feeding what you're doing. So that decision, you talk about decisions that you make. Had I not made that decision, who knows? Who knows where it would have gone?
Who knows what happened?
Yeah.
And what I would love to sort of suss out from you is, now when you look at your career, is there certain things that you would credit your working class roots for?
I think virtually everything, actually, because so much of, I think what it gave me is a great sense of humor. And that may be also my Irish kind of background, because humor for them was fundamentally important. But also, again, you know, again, we grew up listening to the Goons that became Monty Python, and they were culturally very, very important to us. So I think, yes, I do think that sense of having the confidence to know how most people feel and think to a certain extent. You can't say, oh, I can tell you what somebody in Bradford thinks. I've never met somebody in Bradford. I don't know. But because you came from a working class background, and because this revolution was coming from the ground up, you had a confidence in your opinion. Where, it was interesting when we opened an office, BBH, in America, and I went over there for 2.5 years to establish the office and get it up and running. And you realize when you talk to an American client, and they'd like you and they'd talk to you, but you could see in the back of their minds going, but John, you're not American. You've not been brought up here. You don't quite understand. As much as I thought I did, you don't really understand how we feel or think. And even if they didn't articulate it, you could see it was sort of going on in the back of their brains. So here in the UK, because most of the advertising is directed at the mass audience, there aren't many accounts you can work on. How many times you can work on Rolls Royce? You're talking to a kind of the mass of the population, and if you come from there, you feel, I know. So if a client said, "Oh, I don't think that's very funny," I think it's funny, and the people around me would have found this funny. What do you know about it? Well, why are you more authoritative on this than I am? So it did give you that confidence. It did give you that certainty, and I do think that sort of important. Not that I think it's essential, as I said. Shakespeare never went to Italy, but he wrote Romeo and Juliet. But you can make it work for you. I think what happens in life is you have to look at the assets you've got, as an individual. What have you been gifted with? Where'd you come from? Where do you do this? What do you do? What's your sexuality? All this, and you use those in a constructive way, in a sense. And you shouldn't be shy of using those. You shouldn't go, oh, I shouldn't be doing that. I shouldn't sort of, not reference my background or my whatever it might. No, that is what you've been gifted. Use it, but use it positively, use it to engage, use it to include. And in that way, I think you'll kind of get people applauding what you're doing and enjoying what you're doing.
Absolutely. And I guess, when you've done all this, you've got the pinnacle of your career, you're building who you are because you're staying true to who you are as a person. I bet your parents must have been super proud of everything that you had achieved. Did they ever tell you that?
Well, very sadly, my mother died at 47, which was a huge, huge blow. And I became sort of, my father had complications, which I don't need to go into, but we didn't really get on that well. But so they never really quite saw it. Well, my mother didn't see it, which was a great shame. And I do remember coming in and saying to her, because when I left Benson and Bowles, I got fired from Benson and Bowles eventually. And I think it's always good to be fired. I think it's kind of, it's part of the process of growing up. And someone said to me, John, why were you fired? Because I was a pain in the arse. I kept telling them what they were doing was wrong, and they didn't want to hear it. So I'll get rid of him. So I got fired. But then I got another job, and I remember coming back and saying to my mum, I've got this new job, and that's it. And she was very worried. She thought I didn't understand, and I'd blown my career up. And then she said, well, how much are they paying you? And I told her, and I realized it was nearly twice what she was earning as a school secretary. And I could see her face going, oh my God, they're paying you all that money. You better be good. And that was the moment. But I had a lovely experience, which was Campaign magazine, which is, as you know, the magazine, one of the magazines of the industry. And so this was like 1988. And my mum was a school secretary. And they always used to review anybody who was newly appointed creative director at a big agency. They should do a piece on them. This is who they are. This is where they came from. And a lovely guy called Mike Everett had joined Alan Brady and Marsh, which is an agency back then. He was going there as creative director. He'd been bought by Lowhouse Spink. And so they did a big piece on him. And of course, the question was, how did you get into advertising? And I'm reading this. Right? So this is about 1988. All right? I'm reading this. And he says, well, I went to Finchley Grammar School, and John Hegarty's mum was school secretary there. And I'm reading this, and I'm going, what? Oh. And she, if anything went wrong at the school, we always used to go to John's mum, because she was the most wonderful person, and she would put us right and guide us and things like that. And we were called in to see the headmaster to be told that we weren't working and we were going to get booted out of the school. And so John Hegarty's mum said to us, so what you're going to get booted out. What are you thinking about? What are you going to do? And they said, there were two of them. They said, we've got no idea. And she said, well, look, my son, John, he's got a wonderful job in advertising. I think you should think about going into advertising. And if he can do it, I'm sure you can. And I'm reading. So my mum holds the record. I think it's a Guinness Book of Record for, she died in 1967. She appeared in campaign in 1988. I think nobody could have done that. So I think but Mike Everett then told me this lovely story. So that's lovely. So that was the kind of woman she was. And sadly, she died very young.
Oh, she sounds absolutely amazing. And obviously she done well to raise you and your brother.
Yeah.
Were you the only two siblings? Was it just the two of you?
My brother and myself. Yeah.
It was. Well, John, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate this. I'm sure everybody's going to be tuning in, like people certainly in the advertising industry. I don't think they'll be able to get enough of this episode. So thank you so much. Really wise words. And yeah, it's not surprising to see where you are today and how you got there, because it's very well deserved. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Lovely talking to you, and lovely talking to everybody else. Have a great day. Bye.